I'm David Forgacs. I'm the chair of the Italian Studies department here. I'm going to say a few words in a minute, but I just wanted to present the presenters for the opening of this second part of the conference. First up will be Carolyn Dinshaw, who's the Dean for Humanities in the Faculty of Arts and Science. Then I'm going to say a few words, and then Stefano Albertini, Director of the Casa Italiana, will also say something. And then we'll go into open up the second half of the conference. So please, Carolyn Dinshaw.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carolyn Dinshaw, Dean for Humanities here at NYU. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second half of today's symposium on Dante's Rime. Thanks to everyone from migrating south to join us for the afternoon at NYU's beautiful Casa Italiana. It's a tribute to the brilliance of the symposium's directors, Maria Luisa Ardizzone and Teodolinda Barolini, that such a robust turnout on such a wet and cold day is here today. So thanks to everyone who has made this wonderful event possible. And it's especially gratifying to see the Global Dante Project of New York going strong. Though I had a great time teaching the Purgatorio last year in a graduate seminar here, most of my own interaction with Dante's works occurs in connection with my work on Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, the medieval English poet who revered Dante as a great auctor. Chaucer cites Dante by name. This is in marked contrast to his treatment of Boccaccio, whom he steals from shamelessly but never names directly. But Dante, Chaucer treats as an auctor, someone, writes Alastair Minnis, who was at once a writer and an authority, someone not merely to be read, but also to be respected and believed. Thus, a character in Chaucer's Wife of Bath's tale, in the Canterbury Tales, reverentially quotes the wise poet of Florence that hichte Dante, quotes Dante to the effect that true nobility comes not from birth, but from God alone. And thus Dante's name appears in Chaucer's early poem, The House of Fame, Hus of Fama, alongside Virgil's and Claudian's, in a little list of auctores who have written about Aeneas. But Chaucer, and this is why he's my man, is not entirely reverent. His House of Fame, a dream vision poem, features a parody of the Commedia, as a giant eagle sweeps the narrator, named Geoffrey, up into the heavens, complains how much the portly English poet weighs, and even one scholar has suggested, makes a fart joke. There's no mystic rose here. This afternoon's papers and our conference deals with the lyric Dante, materials that Chaucer probably did not know. This is the less studied Dante, and this makes me all the more eager to hear the presentations. So let me turn it over again to David Forgacs and Stefano Albertini, and then to the presenters. Thanks again for coming, and welcome.
Thank you, Carolyn. My bit is going to be the briefest of all. I have probably the least claim of anybody in this room to have much to do with Dante. But I did want to sort of say, since the theme of this conference is the lyric poetry, I do have a personal memory of this. I arrived in Oxford as an undergraduate student in 1971 to do English language and literature as my subject. But I was already getting interested in Italian, which I didn't know at the time. Partly because my father, who was Hungarian, had grown up in Horthy, Hungary, And because of the friendship pact with Mussolini, Italian was introduced as a language in school, and he had at home, he spoke some Italian, he had editions of Dante, Manzoni, and other people, and encouraged me to learn Italian. So I went along to Cecil Grayson's lectures in Oxford, and I went to the second-hand Blackwell's bookshop, and I bought an edition in 2 volumes of Dante's lyric poetry, edited by Kenelm Foster and Patrick Boyd. This was 1971. I think the book had come out the year before. It was already remaindered. and the bookseller... 67, yeah, it is, sorry, that's right. I think it was the book about Boyd's study of the lyric poetry that came out in the 70s. Anyway, so it had been around for a while. I bought this, and the bookseller persuaded me I had to buy the second volume, which was just commentary, even though I was only interested in having the text and the translation. I don't think I ever opened the second volume. And of course, I now know that edition has been in some ways superseded. There's a new edition by Barolini, recent 5 years ago, is that right? I think of the lyric poems with translations and...
The translator is here, that's Richard Lansing.
Okay, excellent, thank you. I didn't know that, so I'm delighted to have you here. So anyway, this is my very small claim to have any connection with Dante's lyric poetry, but I just wanted to say that for me it was a very powerful experience of somebody just getting excited about English literature, including medieval literature. I've travelled a very, very long way away from that now, if anybody who knows my work knows. I haven't done any of this for probably 14, something getting on 40 years now. But it was a very, very exciting discovery to read those lyric poems, extraordinarily powerful, and it got me really interested in Italian. So, thank you, Dante, thank you, Pat Boyd, who of course became my colleague later in Cambridge, and Kenelm Foster, and thank you for the new edition. And I will now hand over to Stefano Albertini.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. I just want to underline once again that this Global Dante project is not a small task on the shoulders of Professor Ardizzone and Professor Barolini, also because they basically were able to bridge a gap that few other divisions of NYU and Columbia have been able to. And for some reason, when they mentioned it to me for the first time, I thought of the Council of Florence, 1438, that brought together the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church for all of a week. And then as soon as they went back, said, no, forget it, we're going to stay separate. No, this reunification, this cooperation is working, is steady, is very strong. We had the fortune to present here the first volume that contains the proceedings of the first symposium of the Global Dante Project on the Monarchia here at the Casa. So it's giving fruits, and it's giving abundant fruits. So for this, I'm very happy, and I congratulate both Maria Luisa and Teo. Dante remains one of the fixtures in the programs of Casa Italiana. Very recently, we started a series with Professor Cornish that is going to be the chair of the next session, and it's entitled Dante and. We couldn't find anything more inclusive and ecumenical than that, but in the intentions of both Alison and myself, is going to give a chance to people who are not necessarily Dante scholars, even if of the 3 speakers we had so far, 2 are Dante scholars, to say something about Dante, to talk about the impact that Dante, his thought, his words, his poetry have on people in different walks of life. And you're not here for me, but I'm delighted that you're here this evening, and I would like now to introduce my colleague Maria Luisa Ardizzone. And I just want to remind you that last night or 2 nights ago, we were both celebrated by the president of NYU for 25 years of service to this university. So please give a hand to Maria Luisa.
I will speak in Italian, because Teo Barolini this morning spoke in English. So I will say more or less the same things. I copy what she said. It's not... ok, parlo in italiano, dunque... do qualche informazione sul Global. Sono lieta, in apertura della seconda parte della giornata dedicata alle rime, di introdurre brevemente in italiano il Global Dante Project of New York. Questo è il 5º convegno che il Global Dante ha messo in atto. Il progetto è nato nel 2014, con l'idea di dedicare all'opera del poeta una serie di convegni annuali per uno studio sistematico della sua opera intera. Un'impresa questa di notevoli proporzioni e di non facile esecuzione, cui Intesa San Paolo, nella persona del professor Bazoli, ha assicurato il suo contributo per 7 anni, seguendo l'intero percorso. Il sostegno, tuttavia, sia di NYU Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimo che della Columbia Italian Academy sono stati di grande aiuto per la realizzazione dell'intero progetto sino a questo momento. Il primo simposio del Global Dante risale al 15 ed era dedicato alla monarchia. Seguono nel 16 un simposio sulla vita nuova, poi sul De Vulgari Eloquentia 2017, sul convivio 2018. Il Global Dante Project continuerà il prossimo anno con le opere latine minori, cui seguirà nel 21 un simposio dedicato alla commedia. Teo Barolini questa mattina ha detto che durerà 2 giorni. Speriamo di essere vivi. Dunque, scusate. Tuttavia l'idea di chi lo ha pensato e creato è di continuare in altra forma l'attività di studio e ricerca avviata con il Global. Intanto nel 18 sono stati pubblicati gli atti dei primi 2 convegni, quello dedicato alla monarchia, Dante's Political Theorist, Reading Monarchia, uscito con Cambridge Scholar Publisher in Inghilterra, e gli atti del convegno dedicati alla vita nuova, Dante la vita nuova, archeologie di un testo, in un numero speciale di studi romanzi. Grazie a quanti sono intervenuti, grazie alla Dean, al professor David Forgacs che ha seguito questo progetto in maniera fattiva, a Stefano Albertini che ha permesso l'avvio il primo anno che è l'anno della monarchia. Grazie a tutti quanti sono qui, agli intervenuti, a quelli che hanno parlato stamattina e a quelli che parleranno oggi pomeriggio. Si cominci con il panel che viene.
All right, good afternoon. I will be terribly brief, I hope. I'm Alison Cornish. I teach here at the Casa Italiana. I was thinking this morning we had things about il tragico and sublimitas and directio voluntatis. And I don't think Fabian Alfie will be offended if I say that we have come downtown. We're going to the low register and comico realistico, as the manuali say. And so let me just say a few words about Fabian, whose work is really original and different from others. Fabian Alfie is professor of Italian at the University of Arizona. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1995. With Professor Kleinhans, I believe. His research specialization is on the literature of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and he has published extensively on Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. He is the author of Dante's Tenzone with Forese Donati, and co-translator of the poetry of Burchiello, deep-fried nouns, hunchbacked pumpkins, and other nonsense. His translation of Folgore da San Gimignano, Folgore da San Gimignano and his followers, should be out in 2019, and he just told me I'll give a plug for his another project that he's working on, which is an edition of something called La Cazzaria, and I leave it to you to imagine what that's about. So please, Fabian Alfie.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you. Yeah, so being the overachiever that I am, when I wrote the draft for this paper, for this talk, it ended up being 25 pages long. When I first read through it, that ended up being at least 45 minutes, and I thought, no, after lunch, everybody's going to be asleep. So I've had to cut quite a bit. Hopefully, during the Q&A, we can talk some more about some of the things that I've had to cut. This is dealing with one sonnet in particular. It's sort of... What's sort of in my wheelhouse is taking one very odd poem and pulling apart to see what you can see within it, and that's what I've done with this particular sonnet. And I'm sure when you saw this on the opuscolo for today, you all had it just fresh in your mind there, because it's one of the more unusual ones in Dante's corpus. The poem Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne is one of the lesser-known compositions of Dante's Rime. The lyric, a sonetto rinterzato, follows a structure similar, but not identical, to that of Morte Villana di Pietà Nemica from the Vita Nova. The rhyme scheme for the sonnet I'll be talking about is on the handout, and hopefully you all have the handout. I passed out the pile. I'm going to have to refer a lot to the handout because, as I said, I had to cut a lot. But if you want to see the rhyme scheme, it's there. It's just out under the sonnet itself. In the case of the poem I'll be examining, Dante introduced settenari into a sonetto caudato, which resulted in a 24-line sonnet. Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne put into verse a fable by Aesop, number 162 to be exact, regarding a council attended by a crow disguised in the plumage of other birds. In Aesop's telling, it's actually a jackdaw. One of the things I actually had to do was look up the 3 different birds, because in the different sources, everybody keeps changing from crow to raven to jackdaw. And as it turns out, they're all within, finally I looked it up on Wikipedia, they're all within the same Corvidae family. So they're blackbirds with similar behaviors, which is probably why the different sources are switching between them over the centuries. That's my hypothesis, anyway. The other birds, to get back, so the crow shows up, dresses herself in the plumage of the other birds. The other birds discover the crow's deception. They strip her and humiliate her. Dante concludes his sonnet with a moral. So too it happens to the man who tries to pass off someone else's fame as his own. As I will show in my paper, this seemingly simple poem cites the fable through several sources and adds new elements to draw the conclusion that is, strictly speaking, Dante's own. Rather than being the mere versification of Aesop, Dante crafts the poem into a socio-political document that touches on broad cultural concerns at the turn of the 14th century. The relative obscurity of the sonnet results in part from its critical reception. While volumes of Dante's lyrics had included it among his works, which starting in the 17th century, some 19th century scholars, such as Pietro Fraticelli and Carl Witte, rejected it. They perceived it to be too different from what they considered to be Dante's typical style. In particular, they objected to its form as a sonetto rinterzato, as well as to Dante's appropriation of a fable by Aesop. In response, Giosuè Carducci and Salvatore Concato noted several examples of sonetti rinterzati in Dante's corpus, and they highlighted the references to Aesop in Inferno 23 and in the 4th book of the Convivio. Much more recently, in an article dedicated to the sonnet's codicology, Domenico De Robertis lists the 4 manuscripts it appears, 2 of which ascribe it directly to Dante. One of them is considered very autorevole and fedele is the word, the expression, and 2 others, it's anonymous. So it's pretty strong manuscript evidence. And on the strength of the manuscript attributions, De Robertis restores it to Dante, and he includes it in his volumes on Dante's lyrics. That's it. That's the bibliography. The brief bibliography about the poem has gravitated almost exclusively around the question of the sonnet's attribution. The purpose of my paper is not to continue the examination of the attribution, but rather to perform a close reading of it, as I just mentioned. In the process, literary notions of satire and 13th century beliefs about gender and class will come to the fore. By analyzing these elements, the study will illustrate how Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne intersects greatly with Dante's works. While it's not my intention that these intersections with Dante's established corpus should prove the attribution to the great poet, they will further reinforce De Robertis' assertion of Dante's authorship. Now, to begin, the sonnet, which cannot be dated accurately, reads as follows, and this is on the handout. Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne, di nicista convenne che ciascun comparisse a tal novella. E la cornacchia, maliziosa e fella, pensò mutar gonella, e da molt'altri uccelli accattò penne. E adornossi, e nel consiglio venne. Ma poco si sostenne perché parea sopra gli altri bella, e l'un domandò l'altro, chi è quella? E sì che finalmente ella fu conosciuta, orrodi che n'avvenne, che tutti gli altri uccelli le fur d'intorno, sì che senza soggiorno la pelarsi, che ella rimase ignuda, e l'un dicea, vedi bella druda, dicea l'altro, ella muda, e così la lasciaro in grande scorno. Similmente divien tutto giorno d'uom che si fa adorno, di fama o di virtù ch'altrui dischiuda, che spesse volte suda dall'altrui caldo, tal che poi agghiaccia. Dunque beato chi per sé procaccia. Now, at the outset of my analysis, the phonology of the poem should be addressed. Of its 5 rhymes, 3 are composed of geminate consonants, enne, ella, accia, and another one is a consonantal rhyme, orno. So 4 of the 5 are very complicated rhymes. Furthermore, the entire composition contains numerous examples of voiceless consonants. As just a brief example, just look at the first 3 verses. They're dominated by the phonemes ch, c, t, s. Quando il consiglio degli ucce tenne, di necessità convenne che ciascun comparisse a tal novella. The emphasis on the harsh sounds like this cannot be coincidental. In his treatise on literature, De Vulgari Eloquentia, Dante prescribed certain phonic traits from the high style, such as voiceless consonants and geminate X and Z, as well as doubled liquids. I'm not going to read it, but it's on your handout. You can see what I'm referring to. Of course, Dante left De Vulgari Eloquentia unfinished, particularly Book 4, in which he would have dealt with the comic style. So he made no definitive statement about it therein. Nonetheless, the implication is that such phonic qualities are available to writers of comedies, and his experience in the Commedia bears this out. Hence, the sonnet is crafted almost in direct violation of the strictures of the high style, thereby indicating its genre. The phonology of the sonnet indicates, in other words, its adherence to the comic style. Put simply, the sound of the poem aids in its interpretation. Beginning in the 12th century, literary critics increasingly justified literature from an ethical perspective. In the succinct formula put forward by Hermann the German, he lived around 1256, all poetry was described either as the art of praising, tragedy, or the art of blaming, comedy. Subsequently, theorists defined comedy with the moral function traditionally served by satire, the reprehension of vice, blaming. Over time, the 2 genres, satire and comedy, increasingly occupied the same conceptual space in the culture of the High Middle Ages. In short, by Dante's age, the genres of comedy and satire had blended into one another to a great degree. So by using this distinctive phonology, Dante is indicating the sonnet's genre as comic/satiric, however we want to look at that. The mere sound of the sonnet indicates that it does not merely constitute the versification of Aesop's fable, but it signals the readers instead to see it as the reprehension of vice. The final 2 verses of the poem, with the moral to the tale, actually bear this out. Now, to get to the poem, the opening 12 verses, which correspond to the first 2 stanzas of the Sonetto Rinterzato, relate much of the narrative. The foolish and malicious crow hears of the council, and she decides to change her clothes by collecting the feathers of the other birds. When she shows up, the other birds resent that she is more beautiful than them, and they inquire about her identity before recognizing her deception. This, as I said, is verses 1 through 12. In order to isolate Dante's specific intent for the poem, it will be necessary to discuss its sources and identify those elements unique to his version. So while the narrative has its origins in Aesop, it actually came to Dante via several intermediaries, and they too aid in the interpretation of the poem. Now, an important source for the sonnet is actually the 3rd epistle by Horace. In it, Horace cautions another man, Celsus, against plagiarizing other people's writings. As you can see, again, it's on your handout, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to read through it, but you can look it over. The relevance for Horace's epistle to Dante is, the relevance of Horace's epistle to Dante's sonnet is easily apparent. Horace has changed Aesop's jackdaw into a crow, cornicula, and he strengthens the moral critique. It's no longer a caution against false appearances. Instead, Horace's epistle chastises Celsus for taking credit for other people's efforts. Thus, in Horace's hands, the fable more explicitly serves to castigate the faults of others, even though the outcome is merely that of losing face among the general population. It should not be forgotten, moreover, that in Dante's eyes, Horace personified one literary genre in particular. That genre was satire, and you will recall Inferno 4, where he calls him Oratio Satiro. Yet Horace was not the only author to mediate Aesop's fable. In the late 12th century, Walter of England, Gualterus Anglicus, translated Aesop into Latin distichs. Walter of England has been tentatively identified with Walter of the Mill, the teacher of William II of Sicily, and the Archbishop of Palermo from 1168 to 1191. In his version, Walter relates the story of the jackdaw among the peacocks, but he alters the moral to reflect Horace's exemplar. Again, it's on your handout if you want to look at it. Those who don't know their own nature diligently snatch at the merits of others. Here, too, the fable more explicitly criticizes the failings of ignorant human beings, describing them as taking what rightly belongs to other people. Hence, it appears to interpret Aesop through the lens of Horace's epistle. Walter's text consists of more than the distichs themselves, however, because there then appear several prose paragraphs that elaborate further on the meaning of the narrative. In them, Walter provides a more expansive interpretation. This is on, the Latin's on the front of your handout and the English is on the back. In Walter's prose, the satirical reprehension of vice is clear. For Walter, the jackdaw personifies the hypocritical leaders of the church, whose saintly appearance makes them dangerous. He associates them with the false prophets of Matthew 7:15. Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. He also describes them like painted tombstones, which are beautiful on the outside, but conceal a rotting corpse within. Walter's disguised jackdaw represents not a mere annoyance, destined for an embarrassing comeuppance, but an authentic threat to the social order. Walter's jackdaw personifies the worst example of the corrupt clergy. And as such, his version of the fable constitutes an example of medieval anti-clericalism. Now, it's important for us to remember that medieval anti-clerical literature frequently did not attack the ideals of the church. On the contrary, those Christian ideals were employed to highlight the sins of the contemporary fallen clerics. The figures of the church were generally depicted as dissolute, negligent, and corrupt, but hypocrisy was the most common charge. Indeed, anti-clerical motifs frequently served as part of the moral purpose of satire, calling for the reform of the church and the renewal of society. All of these general features of medieval anti-clericalism are at play in Walter's version of the fable, for he too yearns for a more ethical church. Now, at this point, you're going to see where I've done some editing, because I don't have time to get into Chiaro d'Avanzati's sonnet, which also relates to the poem. I believe this too had an impact on Dante, although it's much less than the other two. And here I want to talk briefly a bit about how this relates to Dante's corpus overall. The brief examination of the sonnet sources indicate a strong intersection with Dante's greater literary production. For the sake of time, again, I'm only going to talk about this in brief terms. That way I can maintain the focus on the sonnet. However, if you look on your handout, you're going to see two passages. One is from De Monarchia. And here we can see, if we look at it, very much the impact of Walter on Dante. It reads, I'm just going to read the English. And so having excluded these people, now Dante is, in the De Monarchia, at this point, he's arguing against people who are defending the church. And so that's this group. These people, having excluded them, he then adds a second group. And this is a group that are presumably fallen, criticizable, deridable clerics. Others must be included who, covered with ravens' feathers, make a show of being white sheep in the Lord's flock. Here is where we can really see the impact of Walter, because we've got a bit of a mixed metaphor going on. We have the raven's feathers, but white sheep. What's going on? Well, it's clearly a reference to the story of the crow, but mediated with the passage from Matthew 5:17, which relates it to the wolves in sheep's clothing passage. See what I'm talking about? The second reference to the fable in Dante's corpus is a little bit less direct than that one from De Monarchia, and it's from Canto 27 of Paradiso. That is, as you'll recall, the St. Peter's invective against the debased papacy. And as you'll recall, it's just a marvelous invective. Sorry, I'm not used to humidity anymore, coming from Arizona, so you'll forgive me. I'm really sweaty right now, so I'm just taking off my jacket. So to get back to my talk. So as you'll recall, it's an amazing invective against the debased papacy. And before he launches into the invective, Dante gives us a really strange description. He turns bright red, but to explain this turning red, he gives us this reference, and again it's on the handout, qual diverrebbe Jove se Ellie e Marte fossero augelli e cambiassero penne. Birds exchanging feathers, what could that be in reference to? It seems to be calling to mind this particular story. And again, if we think about the way it may have come to Dante mediated through Walter, later in that very invective, he too cites Matthew 5:17. In vesta di pastor lupi rapaci si veggion di qua su per tutti paschi. So it's my assertion that Aesop does not appear only in Inferno 23 in the fourth book of the Convivio, as many as have asserted, but is more pervasive throughout Dante's literary production. Now, to return to the Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne, one of the innovations that Dante brings to the fable in the opening 12 verses is its setting. It's no longer a royal palace. Instead, the sitting is a city council chamber, consiglio. Dante surely had a clear purpose in updating the fable in this manner. In the historical context of the sonnet, a council, consiglio, strongly implied the governing bodies of the communes. The communes had evolved in the 11th and 12th centuries as urban elites, both aristocratic and military, explored novel forms of governance. In the words of Brian Pullen, communes originally were, quote, collective lordships pieced together with jurisdictional rights exercised by small lords who formed part of them, close quote. As the communes developed, the intellectual elites retained the characteristics of nobility, and the communes remained true to the tradition as the cities of nobles. In the Italian communes, moreover, the councils had traditionally been staffed with male patricians, although a wave of popular government followed Frederick II's death. As the decades passed, the power of the urban elites ebbed and flowed relative to that of the popolani. At times, the groups of nobles reclaimed, or attempted to reclaim, their traditional rights to administer justice. Now, none of this discussion is intended to relate any one particular historical event to Dante's poem, as it cannot be dated with the necessary precision to do so. Nonetheless, the sonnet depicts the proper response, culturally speaking, when someone inappropriate appeared in the halls of power. The illegitimacy of the crow, however, has several dimensions. The second innovation that Dante brings to the fable is the gender of the protagonist. While cornacchia is indeed a feminine noun in Italian, Dante goes out of his way to stress the sex of the crow. Although disguised, the other birds recognize her as female, asking, "Chi è quella?" And both they and the narrator refer to her with the feminine pronoun ella, verse 11 and verse 17. Dante's adjectives reinforce her femininity, like maliziosa e fella, bella twice. Furthermore, the sex of the crow becomes paramount in the second half of the sonnet, in which the other birds assault her. In the third stanza, the other birds mercilessly strip her and mock her, they say ella muda, and then they abandon her with great disdain. In the process, they ironically call her a bella druda. Now, according to the Encyclopedia Dantesca, druda has several meanings in Dante's works, and its correlated term, drudo, has a distinctly negative valence when it's applied to Thais' lover in Inferno 18 and to the giant at the end of Purgatorio. It is likely, therefore, that in Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne, Dante intended the derogatory signification of druda as paramour, or more likely in this context, tramp. Put another way, when Dante crafted this sonnet, he deliberately evoked everyday teachings about gender. The crow's presence in the council is inappropriate because council members typically were men. She violates the teaching of St. Paul from 1 Corinthians 14:34 that women were supposed to remain silent in public. The crow, in other words, fraudulently attempts to infiltrate the ruling space of the council. Yet the crow symbolizes more than a woman who just simply tries to speak out of turn. The lexeme druda, in particular, with its negative overtones, connects the poem to the medieval misogynistic writings about women. Stretching back to the time of the Church Fathers, there developed the discourse about women's reprehensible natures. The initial intentions of writers like Saints Augustine and Jerome in their misogynistic texts was to dissuade men from loving women and thereby reinforce monastic chastity. There were many facets to medieval misogynistic discourse, but one strain of it insisted that the female body was not beautiful, but instead it was repulsive and a vessel of filth. In order to entice men, therefore, women needed to use cosmetics to disguise the natural ugliness of their bodies. Many misogynistic writers wrote of the horrors of women's cosmetics. Alexander Neckham, who lived between 1157 and 1217, compared a woman in makeup to a painted tombstone, beautiful on the outside, but containing a rotting corpse within. Sound familiar? Alexander uses the very same metaphor as that used by Walter of England in the commentary on the fable of the jackdaw, suggesting some sort of connection between Aesop and medieval misogyny. In the sonnet, however, Dante also adds that the crow changes her clothing, pensò mutar gonella, verse 5, recalling the concerns of 14th century Italian cities regarding the dress of women. Over the course of the Trecento, some 40 cities passed over 300 sumptuary laws to regulate luxury goods, but they focused on women's attire. Although they were ostensibly about the enforcement of modesty, in practice, the sumptuary laws primarily applied to the lower classes in an attempt to reinforce the social structures of the city. The laws in Florence prescribed corporal punishment for women of lower classes who dressed like upper-class ladies. And servant girls found in violation were to be stripped bare, flogged through the streets, and flogged again in the marketplace. Prostitutes, too, were prohibited from wearing certain types of clothing, and instead they needed to wear special signs of their trade. Any citizen who met a prostitute who was not identified by her clothing had the right to strip her bare. Does all of this sound familiar? The history of the sumptuary laws helps us to make sense of the violent actions of the other birds in Dante's Sonetto Rinterzato. She has illicitly appropriated the beauty of the other birds, and their punishment of her comprises the just retribution for her actions. Nor should it be forgotten that other writers speak derisively of ugly lower-class women who also dressed like noble ladies. I'm thinking of people like Guido Guinizelli in his sonnet Chi vedesse a Lucia un var capuzzo. Dante, too, it should be added, writes approvingly of the sumptuary laws in the 23rd canto of Purgatorio. It is in the last 6 verses of the Sonetto Rinterzato, which correspond to the 4th stanza, that Dante explains the meaning for his fable. So it happens every day, he writes, to the man who adorns himself in the fame or virtue of another. When he does so, he earns from the sweat of another person's brow, even when it's cold. The changeover from a female crow to a male protagonist is not unmotivated, as throughout Europe, the fable of the jackdaw indicated not only painted women, but also pretentious men. The link between ugly crows and sinful men, however, intersects strongly with another of Dante's works. In his canzone Doglia Mireca, Dante chastises women who fall in love with avaricious men. Measuring 7 stanzas long, at 21 verses each, Doglia Mireca may be Dante's longest lyric poem. The canzone warns women against reciprocating the love of men who do not follow virtue. In the opening stanza, Dante explains that beauty in women constitutes the counterpart to virtue in men, and that love results in combining the 2 ideals. Beauty is the female ideal, virtue is the male ideal. Che se virtute a noi, uomini, fu data, e biltà ad voi, donne, e a costor di due poter un fare. The ideal traits of the 2 sexes, beauty and virtue respectively, is not limited to the first stanza, but rather comprises a theme that runs throughout the entire canzone. And just as Doglia Mireca focuses on the parallel of women's beauty and men's virtue, Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne allegorizes the downfall of a wicked man through the parable of an ugly female crow. He's using the polar opposites of those 2 ideals that we see in his canzone. Both poems share the same ideology about men and women, treating beauty and virtue as the distinguishing ideal characteristics of the 2 sexes. In the sonnet, Dante claims that virtue and fame should derive from a man's true nature. In the Enciclopedia Dantesca, the entry on virtue stretches over 6 pages, encompassing a series of nuanced explanations. Nobody wants to delve through all of that. However, at the outset of the entry, virtu is succinctly defined as the reaching of one's perfection through the activation of one's potential. It indicates, in other words, the attainment of the heights of one's nature. Such an interpretation is consistent with what Dante says elsewhere. As he writes in the Convivio, for example, the perfection of a thing coincides with the attaining of its virtue. And all these passages, again, are on your handout. A man's virtue, in short, indicates the apex of his nature as a human being. Yet virtue, as Dante intended it, was related to nobility. Indeed, the very same chapter of Convivio, he treats virtù as the sine qua non of nobility. He goes on to demonstrate in the Convivio that virtue and nobility are in fact one and the same. As he explains its etymology, the word noble was derived from non vile. Hence, for Dante, virtue is not only the distinguishing characteristic of maleness, but it is also the essence of nobility. Throughout the 13th century, in the face of numerous socioeconomic changes in the Italian communes, a debate ensued regarding the essence of function of nobility. Some thinkers applied Aristotle's definition of nobles as having ancient possessions and virtue, while others believed that only virtue defined nobility. Dante numbered in the latter group. The increased social mobility of the age did not result in a challenge to the traditional social hierarchies, nor on the concept or virtues of nobility. If anything, the social ferment of the Duecento sharpened traditional class sensibility, leading to an attempt to redefine nobility in the light of present-day realities, as we've been discussing. Now, it's important for us to contextualize Dante's writings about nobility in the culture of the turn of the 14th century. He did not mean to divorce nobility from its traditional signification as the leaders of society. On the contrary, he wrote in De Monarchia that virtuous nobility conferred the right to rule, and you can see it again on your handout. Not for nothing, then, did he change the setting of Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne to a council chamber, a location in his mind appropriate for men of the highest nobility, as he defined nobility. To return to the moral of the Sonetto Rinterzato, Dante stressed that a man needed to attain a high status based strictly upon his own merits. For a man to achieve a high status based on the sweat of others, like the virtue of an ancestor, for instance, is like an ugly crow wearing the beautiful plumage of other birds. It is analogous to a painted harlot who causes men to fall in love with her fraudulently. In conclusion, the sonnet Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne needs to be understood by the light of the socioeconomic discourse of the late Due and early Trecento. It appears to be a document that narrates, in symbolic form, the downfall of those who pretend to be noble but lack the necessary virtue. By reprehending people whose fame didn't result from virtue, Dante made reference to the comic/satiric genre. Far from being a mere translation of Aesop, Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne fit perfectly into Dante's broader oeuvre. It shares language similar to that of St. Peter's invective in Paradiso 27 and De Monarchia, and most importantly, it presents concepts about men's virtue and women's beauty identical to those of his canzone, Doglia Mireca. While none of this constitutes proof positive of Dante's authorship, when considered along with his with the philological information discussed by Domenico de Robertis, I find it to be convincing. In short, Quando il consiglio degli ucce si tenne is perfectly in line with Dante's political thought and literary practices at the turn of the 14th century. Thank you.
I'm Alessandro Vettori, and I'm very glad to be the chair of this session. We have two speakers, and I'm going to briefly introduce Sarah Diaz, who is our next speaker. She earned her PhD in Italian Studies from New York University with a dissertation on marriage in Dante's comedy. Her research now focuses on marriage, gender, and comic discourses in late medieval and early modern Italian literature. She has published on Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch, and most recently, she published a chapter on Boccaccio's anti-matrimonial invective in the book edited by Olivia Holmes and Dana Stewart, entitled Reconsidering Boccaccio, Medieval Contexts and Global Intertexts. Her interest in comedy and gender led her to the prolific 17th century author and performer Margherita Costa. Her critical edition and translation of Margherita Costa's 1641 farce, The Buffoons, which she co-edited and translated with Jessica Goodalls for the Other Voice in Early Modern Europe series, published by Toronto Centre for Reformation and Renaissance Studies, hit the presses last spring. She is now completing a critical edition and translation of selections from Costa's 1639 love letters for the same series. Sarah Diaz teaches all levels of Italian language, literature, and culture at Fairfield University, where she coordinates the Italian language program and currently serves as the acting director of Italian studies. Her talk today is entitled Dante's Griselda Complex, the Pulcella Nuda, and the Economy of Gift Exchange. Please welcome Sarah Diaz.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Teodolinda Barolini and Maria Luisa Ardizzone, for welcoming me here today. It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to NYU, where I not only completed my dissertation, but I came as an undergraduate student as well. It was here in a room in the Casa Italiana where I took my first class on Dante with Professor John Freccero, where my love affair with Dante began. So it's beautiful to come back and see this come around full circle. So this is a very special experience for me. So thank you for making it possible. Non si vede tanto bene. Okay, Dante's Griselda Complex. One of Dante's earliest surviving lyrics contains a startling reference to sex trafficking. Bear with me for a moment. During his fledgling years of poetic experimentation and Guittonian imitation, Dante composed Se Lippo amico se tu che mi leggi, my dear friend Lippo, if you're reading this. It is, by design, a companion piece in more ways than one. Dante's umile sonetto, speaking in a masculine voice on behalf of the author who created him, respectfully introduces himself to a friend named Lippo, using various expressions of deference. Following an exordium in captatio benevolentia, the sonnet comes before Lippo with a request, and then a gift. He first asks to be heard out with an open mind, mente e lo intelletto. The sonnet then presents Lippo with a timid pulcella nuda, or a nude young girl, who is too ashamed by her exposed body to circulate in public. The sonnet hands her over to Lippo, with one condition. Lippo should act courteously and dress her naked form before taking her as his paramour, or druda, or tramp, but I don't know if that works right here. Lippo is then given license to let his newly clothed lover circulate and presumably be admired wherever she may please. The audacity of this staged sexual transaction, the act of passing a naked maiden from one man to another via an intermediary, seems not to have raised too many eyebrows among critics long accustomed to reading these lyrics metaphorically. Commentaries quickly brush past the literal level, seeing Dante's proposition as an unambiguous request for Lippo to dress lo meo servente core with musical accompaniment. Other viable interpretations have been advanced, including reading the sonnet as an invitation to respond to the ensuing canzone with a gloss, or to illustrate a copy of Dante's text in manuscript form. A lineup of plausible Lippos has been unearthed to support each claim. Only Giunta's commentary, later picked up by Justin Steinberg, notes an additional correlation between the act of dressing his pulcella and a husband or even a lover's duty to provide his beloved with a corredo, a trousseau which typically included clothing. Otherwise, the sexualized image of the canzone as an exposed female body, and a young one at that, has unproblematically been read against Dante's literary tradition and poetic trajectory. For as Barolini notes, Dante's coding of lyrical genres as sexual beings, characterized according to sexual stereotypes, in this youthful poem is largely conventional and belongs to the world of, I quote, codified eroticism that is the courtly love lyric. End quote. Indeed, examples of similarly gendered textual bodies are not uncommon in Dante's works. Take, for example, the pulzelletta cited by Contini and others in their notes on Se Lippo, Messer Brunetto questa pulzelletta. In this light-hearted sonnet, a virginal pulzelletta is sent to Messer Brunetto to celebrate Easter, that is, to party. Messer Brunetto questa pulzelletta, con esso voi se ven la Pasqua a fare, non intendete Pasqua di mangiare, che la non mangia, anzi, vuole essere letta. The message from this pulzelletta is fairly explicit. She would like to be read by Brunetto, slowly, in private, away from the din of noisy fools, giullare. She will not, however, suffer his interpretive ineptitude. If Brunetto proves not to be up to the task, she could be passed along to any number of frati Alberti, ready and willing to examine what has fallen into their hands. And if they too prove to be incapable of the task, they should all consult with a certain Messer Gianno. Even without the aid of paratextual notes explaining the reference to Brunetto, not Latini, Gianno, and the Frati Alberti, at its most basic level, the sonnet invites a group of male readers to share and engage with each other vis-a-vis a lyric characterized as a desirable young woman, a ucceletta. The sonnet lacks any of the shocking nudity of Lippo's Pulcella, but it does nonetheless use gender textual body to mediate an interpretive exchange between men. Messer Brunetto's Pulcelletta certainly supports an understanding of the metaphorical nakedness of Lippo's Pulcella as a proposition for the reader to participate in a hermeneutic act. But while such an interpretation is undoubtedly sound, for today's talk I propose that we take works like Dante's Lippo at face value, pausing to consider the anthropological value of exchanges which, on the literal level, stage a sexual transaction. Or to paraphrase Levi-Strauss's famous formulation, of interest today will be how, in his early Rime, Dante engages in the figurative traffic of women. The parameters for this talk will be fairly limited. I will focus on a small number of works which, like Se Lippo Amico, suggestively feature clothed or unclothed textual ladies. I will narrow down our scope even further by primarily looking at the semi-clad personifications that inhabit the envoys, or congedi, of these lyrics. And as I will argue, the recurring tendency to use these sexually suggestive tropes to engage with a select group of male interlocutors speaks to larger mechanisms of homosocial exchange prevalent in Duecento and Trecento society. In other words, what we will be looking at today is the dynamics of male bonding, figuratively and literally orchestrated through the ritualized exchange of the female body. This approach to Dante's Se Lippo Amico and other poems under consideration is in many ways suggested by Carolyn Dinshaw's work on Chaucer's sexual poetics, and she's no longer in the audience, so I can say what I want. No, just kidding. As her analysis shows, the practice of gendering the literary text as female and sexually enacted upon by an author and a readership gendered as male was in full swing in Dante's day, or shortly thereafter. Though narrowly focused on Chaucer's works, Dinshaw illustrates how the, I quote, representation of the allegorical text as a veiled or clothed woman and the concomitant representation of various literary acts, reading, translating, glossing, creating a literary tradition as masculine acts performed on this feminine body, end quote, frequently recurs across narratives ranging in theme and in structure. Within patriarchal society, she adds, such figurative discourses express larger principles of social organization and social power, where women serve as empty signs forming bonds between men, end quote. I should add that a similar approach to reading the text as a woman was very recently advanced by Elena Lombardi in her book, Imagining the Woman Reader in the Age of Dante, which shares a lot of common ground with the presentation I'm giving today. Dinshaw's research on the feminized object mediating textual exchanges between men naturally finds confirmation in Eve Sedgwick's seminal work on homosociality in English literature. According to Sedgwick, the desired female body serves as a means for the consolidation of an effective partnership between authoritative males. And central to both Dinshaw's and Sedgwick analysis is the idea, based on Levi-Strauss's work and mediated through Gail Rubin's feminist critique, that patriarchal heterosexuality can best be discussed in terms of one or another form of the traffic in women. It is the use of women as exchangeable, perhaps symbolic property for the primary purpose of cementing bonds of men with men, and that's quoting Dinshaw right there. As we shall see within the literary economy of a handful of Dante's early lyrics, the exchange of a gendered symbolic property does indeed serve as a conduit for forging, authorizing, and solidifying friendships between Dante and his circle of poets. Before proceeding, I should note that while the feminized objects traded in these lyrics are authored, possessed, and circulated, they are not commodified. They are extensions of their poet, sent to their addressee as surrogates for their creator, with the expectation that the sender's initial act of generosity will be corresponded with some hermeneutic or creative contribution. As such, I propose that they most closely participate in what anthropologists described as gift rather than commodity exchange. And as gifts, Marcel Mauss long ago observed, they come with the obligation to be reciprocated, thus forging an interpersonal bond between the giver and the receiver. They carry with them some aspect of their donor, some intangible trace of the initiator of the exchange to which they must eventually return. The classic example of the gift exchange serving to solidify social bonds and create interpersonal dependence has as much bearing on the tribal economies first described by Mauss as it does on Dante's Florence. A woman, given in marriage by her father to her groom, creates an organic link between separate families. She does not cease to be her father's daughter. She will always in some way be a part of him, even as she passes into the possession of her new husband. Her movement from the house of one man to another comes with the obligation that the two Añade groups will endeavor to maintain the social ties that bind them. Not coincidentally, this is precisely the kind of ritualized traffic of women and their dowries explored by Klapper-Zuber in her work on marriage practices in medieval and Renaissance Florence. And as she details in a chapter aptly entitled The Griselda Complex, the delicate system of social bookkeeping behind elite Florentine marriages was far from one-sided. Husbands often reciprocated with their own material and symbolic investments or countergifts, which included jewelry, furniture, and of course, dresses. Now, while the Commedia repeatedly speaks of the failure of the Florentine magnates to put an end to factional discord through marriage, the notorious Buondelmonti debacle comes to mind, the act of imparentarsi through women and their movable goods, including clothing, was nonetheless the preferred instrument of social cohesion in Florence at the time, social instrument. Dante, in other words, was undoubtedly familiar with the practice of using women, their bodies, and their clothes as valuable tokens of exchange within a gift economy. Circling back to Dante's Rime, I should mention that the trope of the personified lyrics sent ahead to announce the arrival of ensuing poetic gifts is not unique to texts gendered as female. Take, for example, Sonetto se Meuccio ti ha mostrato. Here, following an obsequious introduction to Meuccio, a servile male sonnet is encouraged to deliver the poet's promise to send his dear friend some of his most precious gems to you, so as to gain the friendship of your heart. Meuccio che ti ama assai, delle sue gioie più care ti manda per raccontarsi al tuo coraggio. Buono. Sibling sonnets are said to follow, solidifying the interpersonal relationship between the sender, Dante, and the recipient he professes to love so dearly. Meuccio, however, since our interest in the line, the trope of clothing and unclothing the feminized lyric, like the ones already outlined in Se Lippo Amico, we turn now to Dante's first ballata, Per una ghirlandetta. Per una ghirlandetta che io vidi mi farà sospirare ogni fiore, eccetera, eccetera. No longer under the sway of Guittone, Dante's first foray into the ballata form, with its flowers, garlands, diminutives, and sighs, is emphatically Cavalcantian. In fact, it is the stylistic resemblance to Guido's work that has led scholars to approximate its date of composition to roughly the same years as the lyrics assembled for the Vita Nuova. Dante lifts the sensual lexicon to sing the praises of his courtly lady Fioretta from Guido's still novistic repertoire, not so subtly flaunting his rhetorical debt to the man who will eventually become his primo amico. The poet, however, is far more explicit about a different act of artistic appropriation in the final stanza. The fresh new words of his ballata, which, like Lippo and Meuccio's sonnet, is directly referred to by its lyric form, have been decked out in someone else's dress. Le parolette mie novelle, che di fiori fatto han ballata, per leggiadria ci hanno toltelle, una vesta che altrui fui data. Però siate pregata, qual uom la canterà, che li facciate onore. The borrowed vesta here are a clear metaphor for the melody of the song, an integral part of the ballata which would typically accompany the written verse and make it, as the name implies, suitable for dancing. Of special interest, though, is how Dante stages an act of divestment, the stripping of the vesta belonging to another, altrui, to dress his own ballata. One feminized lyric has been disrobed to clothe another feminine lyric body. This newly adorned composition, the combination of the author's original words, le parolette mie, and the other's ballata song, are then made public, freely shared to be sung by some unspecified man. Qual uom. The ballata thus involves a community of men, the presumably male composer of the melody of the first ballata, the poet who seizes its song for his own verse, and the singer who the newly clothed ballata must courteously honor. The musical accompaniment for Per una ghirlandetta, passed from ballata to ballata like a second-hand garment, enlists a community of co-creators, each invested with some aspect of the final product. Excuse me. The gendered lyrical body of Per una ghirlandetta is suggested by the personification of its verse form, namely the ballata. She is enacted upon by a number of male agents. In Sellipo, the ensuing canzone is enticingly dangled before her recipient, nude and in need, like a vulnerable young maiden. She comes with the invitation to gallantly clothe her sex body, along with the promise for erotic fulfillment or compensation, since she will become liposdruda or tramp. The call to participate in group hermeneutic or creative acts is thus sexualized through meta-literary tropes of female dress and undress. A community of peers is invited to join in. Some are named, like Lipo, while others have an open invitation, like the potential male singer conjured up in the closing lines of Per una ghirlandetta. In both of these youthful compositions, the exchange of a feminized textual body invites participation and reciprocation. Female corporality and masculine hermeneutics take a very different turn in Dante's mature Song of Exile, Tre donne intorno al cor. The canzone features two distinct, scantily clothed female bodies, which each in their own way express the poet's distance away from the intimate circle of interlocutors he once enjoyed in Florence. Let's set aside the volumes of exegesis on the song, the explication of its moral themes, its allusion to Florentine politics, or even the precise identities of each of the three allegorical ladies who inhabit its stanze. Instead, let's start by taking a closer look at the figure who identifies herself as drittura, or justice, and the startling reference to her exposed sex. The song begins with the arrival of three unaccompanied women, Justice and her sisters, to the seat of love within Dante's heart, almost as if they were visiting the house of a friend, come a casa d'amico. A contrast between inside and outside, inclusion and exclusion, is immediately established on the threshold of Dante's affective psyche. The trio is a sorry lot. Though said to be still quite beautiful, they are tired, anguished, and reduced to tatters by the negligence of man. Drittura, the eldest and most wretched of the three, appears barefoot and ungirt, discinta e scalza, wearing a torn skirt that allows Amor to see her unmentionables. La vide in parte che il tacere è bello. While the poet feigns to be too polite to explicitly name what her shabby clothing cannot conceal, Drittura insists upon drawing Amor's attention to the paucity of her garment, much to his embarrassment. Son drittura, povera, vedi, a pani ed a cintura. Whereas in Sellipo it was the pulcella who was filled with girlish modesty over the nudity of her own body, vergognosa, here it is Amor that is overcome with pain and shame, doglia e vergogna, at the sight of the lady's exposed genitalia. If we compare Drittura to the feminized lyrics already discussed, several key differences stand out. To begin with, though justice is sexualized, she is not truly presented as an object of desire. Her impoverished attire and exposed privates speak more to her sexual rejection than to her powers of attraction. Much the same could be said about all three sisters. Whoever they are and whatever they represent, on the literal level they appear before their kinsman, Amor, as forsaken women, once beautiful and desired, yet now physically abandoned. They circulate alone, freely, without the benefit of a male escort. And being that they are mothers, grandmother, mother, and daughter, they are not exactly virginal, a far cry from the nubile subjects of Dante's youth. As Steinberg notes again, instead of a maiden awaiting her vestizione, Drittura is a married woman who has been undressed and divested of her status, a forerunner to Boccaccio's Griselda, end quote. Tellingly, no one offers to cover up Drittura, or to replace her shabby clothing with a new garment. The absence of such chivalry, or of the kind of staged textual exchange between known, engaged, and desirous interlocutors, on some level speaks to Dante's divorce from the community of peers he clearly enjoyed in his youthful compositions. On the rhetorical level, however, they point to a different class of textual woman. The ritura does not inhabit the same meta-literary register as the pulzella and the ballata of Dante's youth. She is no mere textual personification to be traded between men. Rather, she belongs to a long line of commanding allegorical ladies, the likes of which once visited Boethius, Macrobius, and Alain de Lille. A much closer match to the lady text of Dante's early Rime can instead be found in the songs Congedo, specifically in the first of the two envoys that closes out the canzone. And this canzone is unique in that it has the two congedi, one may have been added later. Canzone a panni tuoi, non ponga uom mano per veder quel che bella donna chiude, bastin le parti nude. Just as he did in Filippo and Per una ghirlandetta, Dante directly addresses his gendered and personified lyric, a canzone, in the poem's closing stanzas. The subject here is no longer the indirect discourse between Amor and the three ladies, or even Dante's moral meditation on the relationship between their allegorical banishment and his own exile. Instead, we are privy to a little game of peekaboo, where the bella donna is suggestively placed just within reach of a desirous reader who wants to see precisely what her clothing conceals. This time, the unsophisticated observer is rudely met with a prohibition. These grabby men are not to lay hands on her dress. The canzone has been instructed to leave such men wanting, denying them the sweet fruit that they desire, and giving them only what is outwardly apparent, le parti nude. For the real prize, the suggestive fior, referenced in the stanza's penultimate verse, is instead reserved for a more discerning reader, a virtuous friend who asks rather than takes. Only to loving hearts such as his will she reveal herself. The key to identifying this ideal interlocutor, this friend and recipient of the canzone's hidden delights, will be his request that she dress herself in new colors, or color novi. As many commentators have noticed, one clue to understanding this reference to the song's change into a more colorful attire may lie in the 25th chapter of the Vita Nuova. Here, amid a discussion of the poet's license to use prosopopeia, specifically in regards to the figure of Amore, Dante explains it would be shameful for one to dress his poetry in figures or rhetorical colors and then, when asked, not know how to strip his words of such dress and show their true meaning. In other words, clothing and unclothing the lyrics, such as Tre donne, should be understood as the poet's use of rhetorical embellishments and his subsequent need to lucidly explain their significance. And in fact, if we accept that Tre donne was originally intended for a section on justice in the unfinished Convivio, then there is good reason to believe that Dante himself planned on laying bare the allegory of the canzone with precisely such a gloss. What has perhaps not been acknowledged, however, is how here in the Vita Nuova, Dante connects male friendship to the trope of dressing and undressing in ways that echo the textual exchanges we have been discussing in the Rime. The passage cited above from the Vita Nuova concludes on an interesting note. After emphasizing the need for poets to be able to expose the real meaning hidden behind their colorful rhetoric, Dante draws a sharp line between foolish poets on one side, quelli che così rimano stoltamente, and himself and Guido Cavalcanti on the other. He grounds his friendship with his primo amico on their shared ability to dress and strip a feminized textual body in a way that differentiates them from poetasters incapable of working beyond the literal level. It is the same contrast between those in and out of the know, those clued into the song's color novi, and those restricted to the surface of things alluded to in the first congedo of the Tre Donne, and even Messer Brunetto questa pulzelletta. And in some ways, it is a vaguely familiar act of hermeneutic affinity mediated over the unclothed body of a woman that kicks off the poetic trajectory of the Vita Nuova itself. After all, the root of Dante's bond with the first among his friends was a lyrical back and forth over Ciascun'alma presa, a sonnet recounting, among other things, Dante's dream of Beatrice's semi-nude body in the arms of love. Naturally, as a flesh and blood woman in Dante's works, the woman of Dante's works, Beatrice is hardly an empty symbol to be traded between men. The fact remains, however, that a youthful work about her barely clothed form and the invitation for a group of male poets to judge, interpret, and reciprocate with their own verse nevertheless served as a token of exchange, ultimately granting Dante access and acceptance into Florentine's elite community of famosi trovatori. The narrative of Dante's first literary transaction with his circle of illustrious peers brings us back to those early poems and those other lyrical ladies who never found their way into the sentimental journey that is the Vita Nuova. Their textual bodies, sent as gifts to an intimate group of fellow poets in Dante's youth, later in his time of exile wandered aimlessly in search of a sympathetic and discerning recipient. The dynamic of homosocial textual exchange, with its clothing and unclothing, inclusion and exclusion, and interpretive give and take, nevertheless remains a constant. After all, it mirrors the traffic of women that anthropologists and historians of gender alike locate in patriarchal societies. And within Dante's world, the movement of a woman from the house of one man to another, a passage symbolically marked through the ritualized disrobing and clothing, was both established literary and nuptial practice. For as Dinshaw observes in her commentary of Boccaccio's tale of Griselda and Petrarch's ensuing translation, both texts dramatized the representation of allegorical reading as a trade, reclothing, marriage, and domestication of women. Dante's acts of symbolic largesse, the gift of his pulcella nuda, the offering up of his little ghirlandetta, and even the search for an amico di virtù worthy of his canzone, each assume a receptive male reader capable of appreciating and ideally reciprocating his precious gifts. And as with all gifts, it is not the object itself, but rather the act of giving and receiving, the thought behind these meta-literary exchanges, that really counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We're moving on to our last speaker, Richard Lansing, who is a professor emeritus at Brandeis University. He has taught courses on medieval and Renaissance Italian and comparative literature. His main publications on Dante include From Image to Idea, a study of the simile in Dante's Commedia, 1977, the translation of Convivio with commentary in 1990, and he edited the 8-volume reference collection of essays, Dante, the Critical Complex, in 2002. As general editor, he published the Dante Encyclopedia, which came out in 2000, and again in paperback in 2010. And I can tell you this is the book that I recommend to my students all the time. It's a great introduction to Dante studies for being so complete and so brief and concise. His translation of Giacomo da Lentini, The Complete Poetry, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2018, and he just gave me a copy of it, so thank you so much. It looks great, and I'm looking forward to looking at it. At the moment, he's engaged in completing a translation of Dante's lyrics, the first volume of which appeared together with the commentary of Teodolinda Barolini in Dante's Lyric Poetry, Poems of Youth and of the Vita Nuova in 2014, and which was given the Scaglione Publication Award for a manuscript in Italian literary studies. His talk today is entitled All is Not Lost, Translating Dante's Rime into English. Richard Lansing.
Thank you for that nice introduction. And thanks go to, of course, Theo Barolini and Maria Luisa for their kind invitation to speak today on a topic that I've spent some time on, and more time now than I had earlier. I just have to find my computer. Meanwhile, while I'm looking for my computer, which is under here, maybe someone would like to hand these out. I'm hoping to get to this little exercise here. I have 25 copies, but a lot of it will be on the screen, ultimately. If you don't get one. Here we go. connect. Password. All right. This way. Then I've got to do the. There we go. Takes a few seconds, I think. Right? No. Let's go back. There we are. Can you hear me? So it's my task to end the evening, what has been a wonderful day of joint company here in discussing Dante's Rime and in seeing one another. I know a lot of people here, and there's some I don't, but it's really good to see some people I haven't seen for years, or I see very rarely. Who is it? Recalling that they were here, I think it was Sarah, recalling that she had graduated from NYU and she was back home in full circle. I couldn't say the same because I didn't speak the same, I didn't speak this morning, but I would have said the same about Columbia. Coming back home after many years, I was an undergraduate here back in the 60s where Luciano Rabbi seduced me into Italian. And it stayed for the whole time. So, not all is lost. The English novelist Somerset Maugham once was asked what were the rules one should observe in writing a novel. After a pause, he answered, "There are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are." One might usefully adapt this remark to delineate the rules for translating poetry from a foreign language into English, and conclude that if there are any, no one knows what they are. Such a quandary has its benefits, of course, for it means that a translator can follow any set of guiding principles without fear of trespassing against some established authority. Despite such a guarantee of freedom from outside interference, the would-be translator quickly learns that the very practice of translation itself is almost universally considered to be an activity artistically doomed to failure from the outset, before it has even been undertaken, so that the only statement about the enterprise that is universally acknowledged is encapsulated in the familiar epigram traditore traduttore, or traduttore traditore, a topos that has a very long history. In its purview, any translated poem amounts to the product of an act of treason. Moreover, treasonous translators are deemed to be, at best, factotums, and are dispatched to a secondary order of inventiveness, to the level of artisan, who is neither artist nor author, but a kind of scribe or even mere hack. Consequently, the translator's vocation is at best a trade, not an art, and one that never rises to the level of a true profession. Better perhaps not even to try. Such an assessment, of course, overstates the case and seems not to have inhibited prospective translators nearly as much as does a still greater, more specific obstacle, one articulated by Robert Frost, who stated in an oft-quoted dictum that poetry is what gets lost in translation. Close quote. The phrase is a shortened version of what he actually said, which was, quote, "I could define poetry this way. It is that which is lost out of both prose and verse in translation." Frost was referring to what is lost when one attempts to translate into one's own words what one thinks a poem is saying or means, or to describe the experience one has in reading a poem, and much less the translation of a poem from one language to another, although many readers have taken it this way. But Frost was clearly not the first to speak about the loss of poetry when in a translated text. For a much earlier statement, we could do no better than to turn to Dante himself, who held a very dim view of the end result of any translation of poetry. Although dim as it was, it did not prevent him from engaging in such activity throughout his entire career. And we've just seen an example of it where he's translating texts from left and right other authors, as if he hadn't said what I'm going to show you he said. Nulla cosa per legame musico armonizzata si può dalla sola quella in altra trasmutare, senza rompere tutta sua dolcezza e armonia. E questa è la cagione perché Omero non si mutò di greco in latino, come l'altra scrittura che avevamo da loro. E questa è la cagione che questa è la cagione perché i versi del Saltario sono senza dolcezza e musica d'armonia. There's a translation below if you need it. His statement, the key word is dolcezza. And the statement for which Dante, dolcezza, which is a virtual synonym for poetry itself. So his statement has the force more of a declamation than a declaration, being couched in what I think is characteristic of his thinking, at least for the Convivio, where it appears in the fourth book, a terseness in definition and absolutism in articulation. His emphasis falls on the all and on the nothing, the nulla and the tutta. There's no room for degree. But the potential loss of sweetness and harmony is not the only dilemma the translator must face. There is also the question of how to render meaning. But on this score, Dante is completely silent. Very likely because for him, translating meant rendering a poem with words taken from another language. I'm suggesting that Dante would not have thought of translating poetry into expository prose, a context in which the question of the loss of dolcezza and armonia would no longer be relevant, or at least as relevant. For Dante, poetry by definition required the presence of rhyme, rhythm, and stanzaic form. Otherwise, it simply wasn't poetry. That would also necessarily be the case for any translation of a poem. It would not be until Milton, the first poet to use blank verse in English, that a poet could abandon the old medieval strictures that bound poetry to generic imperatives. With the passage of another century, translation would enter the modern age and find a degree of redemption in Goethe and in other writers of the Enlightenment. Goethe, for example, remarked, "Say what we may of the inadequacy of translation, yet the work is and will always be one of the weightiest and most worthy undertakings in the general concerns of the world." Which brings us to a consideration of my own views about translation, what premises underlie my work, and what I take to be my responsibility as a translator. Of course, the virtue of fidelity is and remains a sine qua non of all translation. But fidelity in what sense? Fidelity to what exactly? An attempt to provide a literal, word-for-word fidelity, most agree, is very problematic and usually amounts to a contradiction in terms. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, for example, very famous for having translated so many works of the whole age of poetry in the Middle Ages. He rendered Francesca's O animal grazioso e benigno with a word-for-word exactness. O gracious and benignant animal. Can you imagine welcoming Dante like that? An even more dated 19th century sensibility would have been surprised to hear Dante Pilgrim spoken of as an animal. The problem here is not one of literalism, really, but one of mistranslation. In English, animal can never signify living or soul-bearing creature, only beast, or any living thing except a human being. The paramount fidelity must always concern itself with the meaning of a poem, in my view, the signification of its words and phrases in their totality. Translator must capture the structure of a poem's thought and the poet's intention, or the author's intention, and use a linguistic register and lexicon as similar to that of the original as possible. All else is secondary. This means that maintaining fidelity to a poem's formal properties, and here I speak only of rhyme, generally results in a sacrifice or a misrepresentation of its meaning. I've always been highly skeptical of the value of rhyme in translation. What does it really add to the poem that has been translated? The verse format in poetry, the end-stop lines, are already apparent to us. We know we have a poem before us. We don't need rhyme to indicate what is already apparent. The fact that all poetry in the Middle Ages was rhymed ought not obligate the translator to imitate this feature of versification, especially if we believe that a poem's meaning is more important than its ornamentation. Dante's poems are foreign to our modern sensibility and employ a stylized set of conventions for describing the nature of amatory experience. If we do not understand what the text is saying, in what sense can adding rhyme be said to make the poem better poem or more understandable? This would be especially true for any attempt to capture the development of Dante's lyric style from one poem to another, or a poem of one period to a poem of another. Dante guarantees that a poem's sweetness and harmony will be lost in any translation, so why would any translator want to risk as well tolerating an even greater loss of meaning? And does one really hear the presence of rhyme when a translation is read, either visually or audibly? I often finish reading one of Dante's translations rendered by someone else and find myself unaware, completely unaware during the reading of whether rhyme is present or not. At the other end of the spectrum lies translation of poetry into prose. Prose translations enable the prospect of a higher degree of fidelity than verse translations because the vexing issue of form is entirely obviated. But to provide another prose rendering like the highly regarded version of Ken Foster and Patrick Boyd has not really appealed to me, never really appealed to me. My interest has really always been to capture more than just what Dante's meaning is and to replicate in English the poet's felt experience in a format that resembled the format of the original text. I wanted to make Dante's Rime look like poems in their own right in English, not glosses or descriptions. Yet my translations could not simply look like poetry, that is, be a succession of end-stopped lines in prose. It had to be as well, they had to as well sound like poetry, and that required the presence of meter. The purpose of meter is not to confirm the text's identity as poetry, but to facilitate the smooth flow of its verses, so as to make the text readable. Nothing inhibits comprehension more than the absence of rhyme, of rhythm. End-stop lines naturally compel the reader to anticipate that the words moving across the page fit into a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. When they do not, as in free verse, or when the pattern is broken or altered, comprehension of the meaning is immediately frustrated or compromised. The choice of iambic pentameter to render Dante's heptasyllables seemed an obvious choice for me. After all, both formats have the same number of feet, essentially, and place the final accent on the same syllable, the 10th syllable. So rhythm without rhyme. We know that blank verse in iambic pentameter was a good choice for Milton when he wrote the Paradise Lost, so it was good enough for me in the end. A translation of a poem must read like a poem in its own right and display the natural flow of words, sounds, and sequence of thought. Moreover, it should replicate the linguistic register of the vernacular as Dante himself would use it if he were alive today. What I mean is, a translator must use the lingua of his or her own day, not adopt an archaic tonality given to him to give the translation an air of, let us say, medieval artifact. So for me, the matter is really a fairly straightforward situation, because it allows me to place all my bets on realizing a single primary objective, getting as close to the meaning and the spirit that Dante had in his mind when he composed his lyrics, in a vernacular easily accessible to a contemporary audience. Quick example, we are just discussing with, was it Julie? About the, one of the sonnets she was talking about, a poco giorno, right? A poco giorno, translate that. Well, a lot of translators say short day, right? Or a shortened day, but we're not dealing with a day. We're dealing with a time of year when the days are short, right? So you have to use the plural. You have to say, I think I say in the translation I'm working on, because Teo and I are going to publish, hopefully someday, the second volume in which that would appear, to shorten days, right? To shorten days, or not, sorry, to shorter days I have. To shorter days and greater, what's the next word? Rings of shade, I come at last, ah ha ha. So I mean, that's a sense of how you have to have, no one would say today to short day. You say to short day, you think the guy was born somewhere outside of America, because it doesn't sound like English. And I think you have to really replicate the way we would say it today if we were speaking, and the way Dante would certainly say it if he were speaking English. Now, the degree of fidelity sought and achieved will vary not only according to the choice of formal properties, prose or verse, verse with or without rhyme, blank or free verse, but also according to the translator's professional identity. There is what I will call, on the one hand, the academic translator, and there is, on the other, the translator who is already an established poet. Long ago, Dryden, the 17th century English author, literary critic, and translator, claimed that, quote, to be a thorough translator, a man must be a thorough poet. Yet in my own experience as a reader, I have found the opposite generally to be true. I am more persuaded by the view held by Vladimir Nabokov, the novelist, critic, and also translator, who wittily remarked, quote, the main drawback is the fact that the greater the writer's individual talent, the more apt he will be to drown the foreign masterpiece under the sparkling ripples of his own personal style. Instead of dressing up like the real author, he dresses up the author as himself. That is so true. They want to outdo their subject. They're afflicted by the influence of the anxiety of influence. Poets like to make their own poetry even when they are translating poetry, and consequently tend to feel less subservient to their subject than do academic translators. A good translation requires talent on the part of the translator, but not too much talent, not so much talent that it poses an obstacle. Yet this observation itself has its limitations, which shows you why there can be no rules. One has only to bring to mind the remarkable achievement of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's translation of the comedy. And if you go back to it and read it, you'll be amazed how good it is, how right it is, in how many errors he doesn't make, even if it's archaic and a little bit old. For the time, it's just amazing. So, my talk now is going to shift to a second side of the disc. We're going to look at some examples. In sum, given the challenges and pitfalls that confront a translator, the question becomes, how much sweetness and harmony can be retained on the journey from the old to the new country? Enough to make the enterprise worthwhile? The answer will depend on the individual translator, on the success of the individual translation in question. So in addressing Dante's Rime today, I thought it would be useful to look at some examples to see to what extent a translator has succeeded or not succeeded in conveying Dante's sense in an effective manner. And I'm going to start with a passage in a short line, I'm going to keep them very short at the beginning so that if we run out of time, and I'm sure we're running out of it right away, we will have enough to, well, let's spare some time so at the end I can give you this exercise I want you to go through, which I've handed out. So, it's supposed to now go page down, right? Okay. Here are some lines from the fourth book of the Convivio, the Canzone, starting with line 41. Chi definisce uomo e legno animato prima dice non vero e dopo il falso parla non intero, ma più forse non vede. Similmente fu chi tenne impero in definire errato, che prima puosi il falso e d'altro lato con difetto procede. Now it's interesting, in Le dolci rime d'amor chi solia, this is the third canzone of the Convivio, Dante undertakes to validate the truth that nobility is based on an individual's personal worth and worthiness and not on the accident of birth or possession of wealth, a view held by Emperor Frederick II and supported by Aristotle. In the third stanza, Dante demonstrates the fallacy of Frederick's definition by means of an analogy based on a faulty logic. Uomo e legno animato. A mere 4 words. What could be simpler for the translator to translate? And yet, not a single translator into English has gotten it right, if we observe what Dante is really saying. How do they translate it? Wood that is animate is one translation. Animated wood is another. Animate tree. Tree that's animate. Living timber. A living tree, a conscious tree. Now these are almost all the translations available you can find going from Foster and Boyd up to the present day. What's wrong with this? Well, no one has said better than Marisa Luisa Ardizzone what is wrong here, for she said it more succinctly and with greater clarity than other critics, that the error in Dante's example lies in the fact that, quote, the human being, according to the Aristotelian definition in this example, is reduced to the material dimension of the vegetative and sensitive soul, reading as the angels read. That's exactly right. The legno, which means tree, and it does not mean wood, means tree, is the vegetative element, right? It's part of the vegetative world. Animato means that which has a soul, a substance that has a soul. What are the substances that have souls? Only the animals, right? Not trees. Tree has no soul. Well, animal includes everything, including man, right? But not the angels. Includes man. But if that is so, then for Frederick and Aristotle, nobility rests on that alone and ignores entirely his intellect, his reason, which is the distinctive factor in a man which makes him better than the animals. Okay? So we can't say animato. We can't say animate because that doesn't even mean animato. Animate means what? Alive. Something is alive, animate. Or it is lively. Animated is has the same meaning. And even if it did mean what people want it to mean, it would mean the same thing as the tree. A tree is living already, right? So you don't need another word to say it's living. Conscious, indicates or implies rational power. But this is precisely what Dante is trying to leave out here, right? To show the lack of. In fact, if you go to Francesco da Butti, one of the commentators of Dante's comedy, we find that he says, coscienza è atto della ragione procedente dall'intelletto rispettivo ad altra cosa. So this is wrong, and the others are wrong. What are we going to do? What word could we possibly choose? And it's not easy, I'll tell you that. I had to think for a long time to come up with something that may not please. It's correct, but it may not please because it's not a word that's in our vocabulary. Julie was talking today about her students observing. Julie didn't know at the time what mean meant, M-I-E-N, and the students informed her because it was in one of my translations, right? It's not a word you use these days, mean, referring to what someone looks like or their face or their presence. So what's left out here is the distinctive quality of man. It's supposed to be left out, the intellectual power. So we need to find a word that refers only to his animal power, his animal quality. So, did I show it? Yes. Whoever claims a man is a sentient tree, sentient means feeling, has the power of sense. It's correct, although one doesn't talk about things as being sentient or not sentient these days. I understand that. Man is a sentient tree, first says what isn't true, then having said what's false, leaves much unsaid, though can't see more, perhaps. The ruler of the empire likewise erred in making such a claim, for first he says what's false, and then what is more proceeds improperly. So you can give me some feedback on that, and if anybody finds a good translation to let me know, please. Second example is taken from Poscia d'Amor, another canzone by Dante, verses 112 through 114. I'm not going to go through the whole canzone, but just refer to the issue of trying to translate the word falsi. O falsi cavalier, malvagi re, nemici di costei, cal prense delle stelle s'assimiglia. Costei refers to leggiadria, which is the virtue that Dante is praising here, the absence of which is represented by many men in the court or the area that he's referring to. Teo and I have discussed this word many times and have not yet found anything that satisfies both of us, right? It's a very hard word to translate. It's a concept, as Teo says in her book at least, a book some time ago, it comes close to sprezzatura, nonchalance. It means lightness or easiness of presenting oneself. But I'm not going to concern myself with that word today, simply to take up the word falsi. So literally the first one would be, "O false gentleman," although nobody translates it that way. But you all know what falsi means. One translation is, "O would-be knights." Leaving aside the fact that knights is wrong, that's incorrect. The correct word is gentleman. O would-be knights. O pseudo-gentleman, another possibility. O specious gentleman. Specious, it comes into the register which is a little bit foreign to common day, everyday speech. A little strange to use, I think, maybe for this example. I have would-be already. I don't know how that got in there. Oh, self-styled gentleman. That's a very recent translation. Now, self-styled seems to me to be inadequate because these are not people who are styling themselves to be gentlemen. They think they are gentlemen already. They're aware of being gentlemen, but they're not. That's the point. They're not gentlemen. And pseudo-gentleman always struck me. It's perfectly acceptable. It's a good translation. It's a little bit prissy. We don't use pseudo. It has a Greek origin to it. And lastly, oh, bogus gentleman, which is my translation. And I chose that word because it sounds so contemporary, I think. Oh, bogus gentleman. It sounds contemptuous of these people, and Dante is being contemptuous of them. You're real fakes. Oh, bogus gentleman. And I had to have two syllables. So, Let's go to the third example. How are we doing for time? It's becoming, we're running short on time. Theo, what is it? I have one example before going to the general one that I handed out, but maybe I'll skip that and just go right to what I've handed out to you. Because that could take a few minutes, because I want you to read all of those. I've assembled 4 translations, and the question is, what's effective and what isn't? What do you find good? What do you find really not good? It should be avoided. And this is the poem. Se vedi gli occhi miei di pianger vaghi, per novella pietà che il cor mi strugge. Per lei ti prego che da te non fugge, Signor, che tu di tal piaceri svaghi. Con la tua dritta man, cioè, che paghi chi la giustizia uccide e poi rifugge al gran tiranno, dal cui tosco sugge, che egli ha già sparto e vuol che il mondo laghi. E messo ha di paura tanto gelo nel cor dei tuoi fedei, che ciascun tace. Ma tu, fuoco d'amor, lume dal cielo, questa virtù, che nuda e fredda giace, levala su vestita del tuo velo, che senza lei non è intera pace. This is the only sonnet, or poem really, by Dante that does not deal with amatory love of woman, heart. The word heart is here though, so I included it. This is his political poem, the only political poem he has given us. And it's a powerful poem, it really is. And so you have 4 translations before you. Try to read through them fairly quickly. Any question about the Italian syntax or whatever, I can help you with that. We're dealing with 2 figures here, neither of whom is named, but in all likelihood are 2 powerful figures. Philip the Fair of France and the other figure, the one who is fleeing, is Clement V, the Pope. The flight is the flight to Avignon of the papacy, most likely. We don't know this, but it makes very good sense, because this is something that Dante had a lot of anger about, a lot of passion about. And the Signor is God, Lord, the literal Lord. If you're 2 in question, anyone? Justice. Justice has been forsaken, has been left nude and cold on the ground. I suppose it would be nice to read these 4 out loud, but I don't think we have time to. Anyone have any comments on the first, second? Let's take the first and the second because they're both rhymed. These eyes that long to fill, that really isn't quite right. Remove the cause that keeps them longing still. A little bit questionable. The bane of life down here in line 7 is not really accurate. It's not there, of life. It's introduced to fill out the rhyme. Followers' hearts, we're not dealing with followers, but it's all right. You can accept it. It's really the faithful, those who are loyal and trust in justice. Heavenly birth, again, another rhyme word. You need birth to rhyme with earth, but it's not there in line 11. And then the spotless veil, the veil is not spotless, but we need the word to fill out the line. There are a number of translations where you have a perfect translation, but it's a foot short. What do you do with that? Well, I suppose you could say if it's perfect, it's a minor issue. But it's usually something that.
We used to fight about this.
Huh?
We used to fight about
We
this.
did.
I would say, leave it out if it's not there, and he would say, I need the foot, I need the foot.
I need the foot.
So
Most
really,
people like to
for
find the
all
foot.
that he talked about content, he really is absolutely wedded to form, to meter. And he will sacrifice Dante
No,
for
no,
the meter in a second.
I should give an idea what I first sacrificed. The first thing that goes is the end of the line should be masculine, not feminine, right? But, you saw an example here earlier in the translation Julie showed, Sarah showed, wearing. Well, that's feminine. So it's not perfect. It's 5.5 feet. It's acceptable, but it's not ideal. It's true, I try to avoid, and but I've changed. I tell you, I've changed. I'm now considering dropping feet or adding feet, as the case may be. Second one. If you have seen my eyes desiring tears, wonderful flow to it, right? It's not have seen though. We're not talking about have seen. If you see, present tense. I think that's fairly important. Third line, I pray by her to whom you have close links. See, the links has to rhyme with shrinks in this translation, and it just is a clanker. The hand that sears is not correct, really. Introduces a foreign thought. And down in the 8th line, all fruitful ears. Fruitful ears? I've never heard of fruitful ears. Next stanza. For he has fastened such congealing fright, upon your faithful hearts. No, that's not faithful hearts. These are your faithful friends, or your faithful. Your fidelity, right? And there are no hearts there at all. And I think a person would be, if he's using that to substitute for a person, hearts, as a metaphor, you don't expect it. You don't think of that when you hear it or read it. Upon your faithful hearts. Your refers back to what? If you have seen, who's the you? Two. No. Yeah, two. It's talking to God, right? You, God, if you have seen this, and your faithful hearts is not God's faithful hearts. Then we have 3 blank verse, and 4 also blank verse but partially rhyme.
So which is your favorite?
Well, you have to guess. Sometimes I do this with people.
I think the 4th. Number 4.
Okay.
This is, in my opinion, very good. Sorry.
I'll say it is. I mean, there's no question. It's good.
Yeah, because
Except for one
it's
thing.
natural.
One thing.
The result is natural.
Yeah.
That's the great
flow.
thing.
Flows beautifully. I
Yeah.
agree. And has with terror frozen so the hearts of those who serve you that to speak is ill. What does that mean? To speak is ill. He's saying that ciascun pace. Or as I put it, all are mute.
Yeah.
That's what it says. And since you can say that, and the figure there, why not do it? No one speaks. You can say that. All are mute. So mine's the third one. What do I like about my own?
I mean, sorry. I would say maybe something can be also changed.
Absolutely.
The result is great here. I
Exactly.
would say some details could be improved.
You can say these things. You don't have to be literal. You shouldn't be. You should find what sounds good and works and is true. But fruitful ears, who has up? Those are corn. That's corn. Fruitful ears of corn, right? Oklahoma. To speak is ill. Ill what? Ill-mannered, ill something. It's your voice. for some new agony that rends my heart, my lord. I beg you, for the sake of her, who never leaves you, purge them of this wish. I mean, with your right hand, repay the one who butchers justice, then takes refuge with that ruthless tyrant, nursing on the poison he's already spewed to flood the world. Yeah, I like the sound of those words that sort of bite into the object of Dante's contempt. So butcher is an accentuated form of kill, obviously. Dante doesn't say butcher, he says kill. But butcher sounds appropriate given the subject. Ruthless, well, the word is grande. So when you use grande, you have a lot of freedom because that word can mean, it should mean great with respect to the thing it's modifying. So if a tyrant is a bad person, it's got to be a great bad, something really bad. And tyrants are ruthless. That's what we commonly call them. It communicates immediately the idea. Nursing is an invention also. Spewed is a more forceful way of putting what Dante says. And who has numbed the hearts of your true friends with such a chill of fear that all are mute. But you, the fire of love, celestial light, lift up this virtue that lies bare and cold on the ground, clothes her in your veil. For without her, there is no peace on earth. And those words, like several others in the poem, evoke the liturgy, right? Pax intera, hominibus, right? Exactly the same word. He ends on pace because that's his desired object. That's what we're looking for. That's also what Petrarch uses to complete his canzoniere. The last word is pace. Okay, thank you.
Are there questions, and not just for the last two speakers, but for speakers of the whole day, so that we can maybe start a discussion on and have a sort of conclusion for the day with a final discussion? Yes. Professor Brugnolo.
Posso intervenire in italiano? Sì, le passano. Grazie. No, solo anche perché questo convegno è stato così interessante che per la signora Diaz ho un suggerimento per incrementare il suo dossier di riferimenti in Dante alla nudità femminile, perché Dante era abbastanza ossessionato dalla nudità femminile, come si è visto a vari livelli, come si è visto anche qui dal sonetto, questa virtù che nuda e fredda giace, eccetera. Ecco, e come lei ha anche mostrato. No, volevo solo dire se può eventualmente essere integrato nel suo dossier. Ho scritto un articolo qualche anno fa su un verso della Sestina di Dante, in cui Dante alla fine della Sestina dice che il poeta sarebbe disposto a qualsiasi umiliazione, pur, dice, sol per veder dove i suoi panni fanno ombra, dove i panni, che in genere i commentatori interpretavano dove i suoi vestiti gettano ombra, che è un'interpretazione un po' assurda. In realtà io ho mostrato sulla scorta già un'idea di Piccone, e credo anche del professor Klein, se ben ricordo, che lì si tratta di vedere le parti che i vestiti coprono, cioè la nudità della donna. Ecco, quindi può essere anche questo integrato anche se lì forse poi, come anche nel sonetto, ci può essere anche un'interpretazione allegorica, come lei ha mostrato, no? Denudare, eccetera, eccetera. Ecco, questo solo a integrazione delle cose. Se posso anche richiamarmi a una relazione di questa mattina, visto che Lansing ha citato quel bellissimo sonetto "Se vedi gli occhi miei di pianger vaghi", no, la relazione del professor Kleinenz sul sonetto di Dante, che giustamente lei diceva Dante non è un innovatore del sonetto, il vero grande innovatore lo è semmai sui contenuti, ma dal punto di vista del testo, della forma, lo sarà Petrarca naturalmente, il grande codificatore del sonetto, con una eccezione che era proprio questa del sonetto "Se vedi gli occhi miei di pianger vaghi", perché prelude alla grande innovazione di Petrarca, quella del sonetto monoperiodale, in cui dal verso 1 al verso 14 sintatticamente è un unico periodo, e qui Dante lo precede un po', in parte, in questo sonetto, perché, come avete visto, dal verso 1 al verso 10 è un unico periodo sintattico, cosa che è rarissima in Dante, che invece mantiene sempre la tradizionale suddivisione, quartine, terzine, eccetera. Ecco, questo per incrementare, insomma, la sua analisi del sonetto, perché il sonetto di Dante meriterebbe di essere studiato come è stato fatto ultimamente per quello di Petrarca. Ecco, ultima cosa, professor Lansing, no, che ha mostrato la sfiducia di Dante nella traduzione, e poi Dante è un grande traduttore. Dante è un grande, traduce il Padre Nostro all'inizio di un canto traduce il Padre Nostro, traduce dei versi di Virgilio. Agnosco vetera vestigia flamme, conosco i segni dell'antica fiamma. È un grande traduttore, malgrado abbia questa diffidenza, questa sfiducia nella traduzione. Grazie.
Thank you so much.